Looking at the work you did when you were doing your PhD and the work you're continuing to do, you clearly have a very strong interest in this question of state building, state capacity, state resiliency. So how did you come to be focused on this topic as the core of your academic work? And as a follow-up, what are the questions or the outstanding intellectual or research questions that are driving your work moving forward?
Well, I think, when I came to the US for graduate school, this is, a long time ago, a lot of people ask me, why is the Chinese state so strong? Because, we have this very popular view that the Chinese government can basically do anything. They can dictate how many children, people have, and then they can make people take the vaccine. So we are all very impressed by what social scientists call state capacity of the Chinese government. And then at the time, I was thinking about, first of all, why the Chinese state was so strong, how the Chinese state became a very strong state. And then the second question, kind of a normative concern that I had was because it is a very strong state, it can do anything. So therefore, as a social scientist, I was thinking about what are some of the mechanisms that can constrain a very strong state, which is, what are some of the social or economic mechanisms that can make the state do something that is in the benefits of the society, of all the citizens in the country. And then when I started my dissertation, the second question, the normative question was the motivation to write something about, what constrained a very strong state. And also, this is a state that is not democratic. This is a non-democratic state. Therefore, the leaders are not voted, not elected by the people in the country. Therefore, I was thinking about, what are some of the non-electoral mechanisms that can really tie the hands of the leaders in this country. And then that was the original motivation of my dissertation. Therefore, so my dissertation was about how economic actors, how foreign actors, for example, how foreign investors, when they went to China, and then how they use the legal system to constrain the power of the Chinese government. So that's the original motivation of my first project. And then after I was done with my first project, I still was puzzled by this question, why was the Chinese state so strong in the first place? And then that became the motivation of my current project, which is the second book. That is, I try to look at Chinese history, to look at how the Chinese state came about, so the kind of the birth of the Chinese state, how a strong state was born, and then how that strong state endured for such a long time. So those are the questions that, motivated these two projects.
When you think about future research, what are the questions in your, when you're in the shower and you're sitting there thinking, well, how the hell is that the case? Are there any really outstanding ones that continue to puzzle you about continuing practices or future evolutions of the Chinese state?
Yeah, when I'm in the shower, I try not to think about research questions, but once in a while, the key question I'm thinking about is, just looking at China for the last, 2 millennium. And, one question always puzzled me is, we have this regime or this, this country that has such a long civilization, let's say more than 2,000 years. And then for this 2,000 years, they have a very stable form of government. They're certainly different, for example, in dynastic China, in contemporary China, we are certainly seeing very different forms of government. But I think the basic structure of the state, is very similar, in the last 2,000 years. That is, you have a non-democratically elected leader, you have a meritocratic bureaucracy, then you have a society that, sometimes compete with the state, but sometimes, most of the times collaborate with the state. So therefore, the puzzle that always interests me is, how come this basic form of government or this basic form of state has been so durable, right? So durable for, 2,000 years. But then the second dimension of the question is, looking at the ups and downs of the Chinese state, thinking about, the foundation, in the Qin dynasty 2,000 years ago, but also the collapse of imperial China in early 20th century, and then the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and then the founding of the PRC in the mid 20th century. It always intrigued me to think about, what explains this exceptional durability of the state, but also the ups and downs of the state. That is, you see the foundation of new dynasty, the foundation of new regimes, but also the collapse of the state. But then, this basic form of the government stayed the same. That is, no matter what happens, you have those dynasties, new regimes, but continually China keep going back to the same form of government, over and over again. So I think that's the fundamental puzzle that has been interesting me.
I'm getting ahead of myself, but while I'm still thinking of it, I wanted to ask you if you and I guess we'd have to assume we cryogenically froze our brains, but let's pretend, 200 years from now, we're on Zoom and we're having a conversation, we're returning to this. Do you think we will look at the contemporary CCP under the Xi administration as a disjuncture in this long story of relatively stable structure and style of Chinese governance? Will this be something new, or will this just be part of this longer lineage and story? And I ask that because, of course, we have a very present bias, but one of the consensus that seems to be emerging is just how different Chinese rule is nowadays. Different because technology is enabling new capacities that previous rulers, of course, have never dreamed of in terms of enforcing control. But also, you were mentioning sort of meritocratic, bureaucracies. We seem to be seeing a new evolution in terms of bureaucratic governance with the party replacing traditional, state council government bureaucracies. So I'm wondering, are we overreacting and seeing a disjuncture in the Xi administration, or is there something new here?
Well, first of all, I hope in 2000 years we're not on Zoom anymore. I'm really tired of Zoom after 18 months of Zoom meetings. But that's a great question, Jude. I think one way to think about this, I do think there are a lot of disjunctures, when we think about, the Chinese Communist Revolution and also the new regime, since 1949, the biggest difference, I think, is there's now a party, there's now a modern party, the Chinese Communist Party, which is an organization that we have never seen before in Chinese history. And then this party, as an organization, as a modern party organization, is organizing the elites in a way that Chinese elites were never organized before. So, we'll go into details later, about how the Chinese elites were organized in imperial China. But I think, we are seeing something that is unprecedented in Chinese history. That is, we have this modern party organization that can incentivize, can recruit, and also can organize the life of party members. I think that's very different from Chinese history. But still, I think that, some of the basic foundations of the regime, to me, are very similar to how China was governed a long time ago. And then, it's probably an exaggeration to see that, the PRC is another dynasty. But for me, it's very helpful to look at PRC as a new dynasty, from this long-term view. That is, we had dynasties, since the Qin dynasty long time ago, and then we have the ups and downs of dynasties, and then therefore, it's very helpful to think about the PRC as the current dynasty we are living in. It's not very accurate, I acknowledge, it's very different from imperial China, but I think from a long-term historical view, I think it's very helpful as a social scientist to analyze contemporary China as one of the new dynasties. And so therefore we can use some of the knowledge, the wisdom we gained from Chinese history to understand what's going on in contemporary China.
That's a good segue to now explore the guts of the paper you sent, which actually we were just talking before we started recording is really a shortened version of a book manuscript, which you've just turned in to Princeton University Press. So eagerly look forward to its final publication. I wanted to ask a few level-setting questions here before we really dive into the discussion. And there was a really interesting line you had in the section on how this work contributes to the literature. If the audience would just indulge me for a moment, I'm going to read 2 sentences from this. You write, "Most countries have not created a rule based on consent, but are still run by an autocrat. It is time to recognize alternative paths of state development not as aberrant, but as opportunities to develop a new lens to analyze state building." And it felt like in this, in these 2 sentences were obviously a summation of the field and where you see it prioritizing or emphasizing certain case studies or certain developments and prioritizing those over some which likely deserve more merit. And indeed, this very much fits with a reckoning that I think we're having, moving away from a Whiggish expectation that all states are on a linear trajectory towards some sort of, democratic liberal norm, and now understanding the plurality of state organization in non-democratic ways is likely an enduring feature, and we're all kind of catching up to understand that. But I wanted to ask you, what was underlying those 2 sentences, and where was the field treating non-European state development in a way that is aberrant, and what is the impact that that's been having on how we think about and analyze political diversity?
Yeah, I think the motivation was really my frustration with the old literature, I think, in political science. And, it's getting better now, but I think the earlier literature in political science on state building, on state development, but also on democratization, on political changes in general, basically is based on what I call a convergence assumption. That is, they assume that every country in the world will become like Denmark, right? There's a very famous phrase, go to Denmark. And then it's, was very popular, in the 1960s, 1970s in the so-called modernization theory. But I think the thinking behind the convergence hypothesis is still in a lot of minds among the social scientists, that we assume that, Europe is the future, or, is the model, is the standard, is the benchmark. And then, every country in Africa, for example, in Asia, in Latin America will someday, in the future, it takes a long time maybe, but someday they will become like Europe. And then in terms of, state building, that they assume, for example, representative institutions will emerge in those places, and they have strong taxation, monopoly over violence, but also in terms of form of government, for example, democracy, elections, so on and so forth. I was very frustrated when I read the literature. I felt that, first of all, if there was a standard, I think, it should be China, not Europe, for example, because, China started, the form of government, or the type of state really emerged in China 2000 years ago, much, much earlier than the European standard emerged. So therefore, if there's a standard, I think it should be the Chinese standard, not the European standard. But also, I think the more important point is, we have living under the same form of government in China for thousands of years. And then, even though we assume that we might change in the future, but then taking the large share of history into account, we should treat this form of government very seriously, not as some outliers, right? This is not an outlier from the standard, from the benchmark, but this is probably a very stable form of government. And then the literature hasn't really treated in that way. And then one of the goals in this book is, I'm trying to say that, we should take it very, very serious, because this form of government has been enduring for 2000 years, until today. And then we should really study it and then think about what are some of the mechanisms that have sustained this type of government for such a long time.
Just a second level set question is, just briefly, could you use the word, and obviously this is in the literature as well, state capacity. Just briefly discuss what is state capacity.
Yeah, intuitively, it means that degree to which the state can mobilize the society, right? That's the short version of it. But then, more concretely, we as social scientists often look at, for example, taxation as one indicator through which the state can mobilize society, because, revenues are so important for the state to fight wars, to win wars. Therefore, one way we look at state society relations, but also state capacity, is the degree to which the state can mobilize financial resources from the society. That is, how much tax the state can collect from the society, from the elites in particular, because nobody wants to pay taxes, right? And then to mobilize people to pay taxes, there has to be some agreement between the ruler and then the elites. And then there has to be something the elites can gain from paying taxes. And then the idea that the state can really extract money from the elites, require information about how much income people are making, but also about, where people are living, how many people there are, and also the timing of things. So therefore, as a very concrete indicator, we often look at taxation as an indicator of state capacity.
Although your paper focuses, or the book focuses primarily on imperial China, there's a lot of comparative work that you're doing to benchmark the development of the Chinese state. And indeed, you start out the paper that you sent me talking about something called the King's Dilemma, which is a Samuel Huntington phrase. And actually, that reminded me, I was going to say one of the more recent popular works of political science on state building, which decentered the West, was, of course, Francis Fukuyama's great 2-volume on state building, which starts with the Indian state and the Chinese state. So I think recognizing how, if we're trying to think of the states that we should be studying, it's not in Europe, but it's actually farther to the east, where we're going to learn about some of the significant and sophisticated developments of state capacity. And sorry, my brain went there because, of course, his great teacher was Samuel Huntington. So you start out your paper talking about this one of the many dilemmas that rulers have to face, but you focus on one specific to open the paper, and that is the king's dilemma. So I wanted to ask you, what is the king's dilemma, and how did European rulers solve this dilemma?
So the king's dilemma is a phrase used in Huntington's book, the political order in changing societies. And, what he meant at the time in the book was that, he called it the king's dilemma, survival versus success. And then the idea was that, for a lot of rulers in the world, you cannot get both. You either get survival or get success. And when you become really, really successful, you are also facing a lot of risks. So I used the king's dilemma to describe a scenario where, European kings and queens were facing this trade-off between success and survival. That is, for a long time in the medieval era, for example, the kings and queens were trying to extract resources from the elites to fight wars. A lot of kingdoms in Europe, so they have to fight wars. And to fight wars, they have to, pay the soldiers, and then therefore they have to extract resources from the elites. And then when they extract more resources from the elites, that made them more successful because they can get more money, they can win wars. But then that creates a problem, that is, you are taking too much from the elites. And then that will create more risks for the kings and the queens. And then therefore, in the medieval era, a lot of kings were deposed by the elites. For example, thinking about the Glorious Revolution, Charles was killed by the elites because he taxed too much, right? So I think, the scenario was very common in other countries as well. In China, we can think of, various emperors, being assassinated because he took too much, right? I tried to start the article with that dilemma that a lot of rulers were facing. That is, they can either be very successful in terms of extracting resources, or they can be very stable. That is, they can stay in their power for a long time, but they cannot take too much money from the elites.
You contrast that with what you called the emperor's, or you mentioned in, I think, comparative sense, the emperor's dilemma, which is, of course, looking at imperial China. So if I could ask you the same question, state development, imperial China, what was the emperor's dilemma? How were they interacting with and facing challenges from their own elite?
Yeah, so the king's dilemma gradually was solved in the 13th century, 14th century because of the emergence of representative institutions. That is, in Europe, gradually the kings and queens started to use representative institutions to get the consent of the elites when they want to tax the elites. Say, for example, after the Glorious Revolution, the English rulers started to use the parliament to get the agreement from the elites before they taxed them. And then therefore, in the literature, they argue that this type of representative institutions played a very important role in solving the king's dilemma. That is, they lengthened the duration of rulers in Europe. That is, they made the rulers very, very durable because the elites now can bargain with the kings and queens. They don't have to kill them. But also at the same time, the representative institutions also empowered the kings and the queens because they enabled the kings and the queens to tax the elites in an institutional way. So that's how the king's dilemma was solved in Europe. I made this argument in some of my other works that representative institutions didn't emerge in China because of the political geography. China has been unified for a long time. It was a very big country, so the elites didn't have a lot of bargaining power with it. So the emperor's dilemma was that, very similar to the king's dilemma. That is, the Chinese emperors were also trying to collect a lot of taxes from the elites, but then they were also facing rebellions, risks posed by the elites. And then when I talk about the emperor's dilemma in my paper, I mean that there are two different types of elite social structures that can contribute to either the survival of rulers or the success of rulers. And then, so I use the words of star versus bow tie to describe these two types of social structures. So in one scenario, for example, I call this star network, where the Chinese elites were organized in a very centralized way. That is, they were connecting with their families, social groups in different localities in the empire, but also in the center, the elites were also connected with each other. I call it a star network. And then in this network, it's very conducive to state capacity, because when you have a coherent central elites, they have a very strong incentive to strengthen the central state, because they can benefit from a strong central state, because they have families and then social connections are everywhere. So they can benefit from a very strong central government. And in a sense, they have a very strong incentive to building a strong state. And that is the success of the Chinese state. But then the problem is when you have a very coherent central elites, they can also take collective action to rebel against the ruler. That is, they will pose very severe threats to the stability of the rulers. We see that, for example, in the Tang Dynasty, where the Tang aristocrats were very coherent. Therefore, they could take collective actions to kill the emperors. That's the dilemma. So the Chinese emperors at the time had a very strong state capacity. They could tax people very, very strongly, but then at the same time, they also face very severe risks of being assassinated by the elites. In another scenario where I call the bow tie network, where the central elites are not connected with each other. So they're relatively isolated with each other, and then but they have their own kind of territories. They have their own regions they can connect with. But then in the center, the central elites are not connected with each other. And then I call it the bow tie network because it looks like a bow tie. And then in that sense, it's very bad for state capacity because, in the center, the elites only care about local interests because all their families, for example, are from this one county, in this one province. So they only care about, diverting central resources to this one locality to make their families stronger, to keep the resources in the hands of their families, not to strengthen the central state. So this is very bad for state capacity. So it's bad for the success of the ruler. But then I argue that this type of social structure of the elites is very good for the survival of the ruler because, they are disconnected. So say, for example, in the center, there are elites, but then they're not connected with each other. So it's very hard for them to rebel against the ruler because it's very costly for them to coordinate on rebellions. And then so in this scenario, under a bow tie network, I argue that, it's good for the survival of the ruler, but really bad for state capacity.
Can I ask what exerts pressure on the shape of that elite network? In other words, how does a star-shaped network take form in the first place, or vice versa? How does a bow tie network take form in the first place? Is this a pull factor where you've got the leader orchestrating the structure of the elite network such that he or she prefers success over, I guess if this is possible, over survival? Or are there kind of exogenous, environmental factors? And then related to that, you wrote in the paper that for a good stretch of time in medieval China, you had this relatively stable star-shaped network, which, as you just mentioned, boosted state capacity. But this gave way around the 9th century and morphed to become a bow-type shaped network. So what created that disjuncture in the shape of the network?
In the book, so I call the social structure of the elite social terrain. This is kind of, how the elites were organized socially. And then, in the book, I call it, the state can make social terrain, and then the social terrain can make the state, to paraphrase Charles Tilly. And then the idea is that it's both, the influence comes from both directions. That is, the ruler can take some opportunity. When there are opportunities, the ruler will take the opportunity to reshape the structure of the elites. And then once the structure of the elites is shaped, the social terrain or the social structure of the elites can shape the state. It comes both ways. And then in the Chinese context, so I talk about, what happened, for example, in the 9th century. This is, the end of the Tang Dynasty, the beginning of the Song Dynasty. And what happened there was, in the first place, there was a very important climate change event. In the late 9th century, China had some of the coldest years, in the last 2,000 years. And then those coldest years produced famine conditions in China, and which produced, rebellions. And then one of the biggest rebellions at the time was the Huangchao rebellion. Huangchao was a salt merchant. So he led thousands of rebels, and then they conquered the capitals of the Tang Dynasty at the time, which was Luoyang and also Chang'an. And then at the time, all the Tang elites, the Tang aristocrats were living in the capitals, in Chang'an and Luoyang, also in the corridor between these two cities. And when the Huangchao rebels went in, they killed all the families. So they killed all the aristocratic families in the Tang Dynasty, which destroyed what I call the star network. So this is the end of the star network. But then, how they transitioned to the bow tie network, is a longer story. That is, so for quite some time, there was, this power vacuum in China. There were 200 families, were killed during the Huangchao rebellion. So between the Tang and Song, there was this power vacuum. But gradually, in the beginning of the Song Dynasty, the Song emperor started to use a new mechanism to choose elites. That is, without the aristocratic families, they had to come up with a new way to choose the bureaucrats. And then what they came up with was to continue a tradition, but a very small tradition started in the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the civil service examination system. So the rulers in Sui and Tang started to use it, but not very systematically. Only a very small percentage of the bureaucrats were recruited through the examinations. So starting in the Song dynasty, the emperor really started to systematically rely on the civil service examinations to choose bureaucrats. And then what happened after this change was that the type of people that were chosen by this recruitment mechanism changed in the Song dynasty. That is, once people need to take the exams to become bureaucrats, it really favored the sons and grandsons of the local landlord families, the local gentry that we call them. Because those people had land, so they can use the land income to invest in the education of their children. And then their sons and grandsons can take the examination systems and then become bureaucrats. But then the type of elites that started to flow into the central government become very different from the Tang elites. That is, starting from the Song dynasty, we start to see the flow of local elites flowing into the central government. That is, people have local ties. People have, marriage ties, social ties with the local people. That is, for example, I show in the book that in terms of marriages, starting in the Song dynasty, you start to see that most of the people who work in the central government, the central bureaucrats, their marriages are very, very localized. That is, they tend to marry, the daughters of the neighbors, basically. And then that dramatically changed the incentive of the elites, because once your social relations are very local, you tend to care about your local interests, your families, for example, your marriage networks, your in-laws, for example, your properties in your localities. You don't care about the central government anymore. So therefore, the change of the elites also led to a dramatic change in their policy preferences starting in the Song dynasty.
The fruits of this change in the terrain of elite networks is shown very strikingly on a graph that you have that charts the probability of ruler disposal by elites over the course of 2,000 years. And of course, this is an audio podcast, but folks can go out and buy the book when it's out to see it. But it shows this dramatic and enduring decline in that probability starting around the Song dynasty and continuing until the very end of the Qing dynasty. And I suppose that actually sets up a really good transition to just a final few questions on bringing this up to the present. You've laid out this really important tension between success in state capacity, the state's ability to effectively mobilize, and the survivability of the ruler, or the ruler's sense of security and power. Of course, when I think about contemporary China, one of the things that is so striking about the past 10 years or so has been what appears to be a significant shape reorientation of elite networks in China, and indeed seeing examples of where even at a kind of a technocratic level, folks like Cai Qi, who's the party secretary of Beijing, was moved up because of his relationship with Xi Jinping, not because he had, in a structured way, moved up the ladder. And so I wonder, as you think about shapes of elite networks, do you have any views on how we might be seeing a reshaping of elite networks today? And more importantly, I think this tension that you describe between capacity and security of the ruler, how does this really important thesis, which you've explored historically in imperial China, how does that inform how we should be thinking about current and future evolutions of Chinese governance?
One thing always interests me is, for example, the current anti-corruption campaign that is going on in China. And then, we have done a lot of studies on this, and then, so why it happened, the effects of this. And then one of the more popular arguments about why Xi Jinping has been carrying out the anti-corruption campaign is that he tries to centralize the Chinese bureaucracy by eliminating factions, right? So, and then, we all know that there are factions within the Chinese Communist Party is a party, but then there are factions within the party. The factions might be based on, social ties, educational ties, but also on policy preferences, whatever reason, but there are factions within the party. That argument always puzzles me because, from my experience of studying imperial China was that factions were always beneficial for the ruler, as long as the ruler can sit above the factions. So the way the Chinese rulers in the past, in all the dynasties in the last 2,000 years, one really smart strategy they have been using in lengthening their rule was to play the factions against each other, right? So they intentionally created factions, so therefore the elites can fight with each other, not with the ruler. Playing the factions against each other or taking advantage of the cleavages among the elites has been really one of the most important mechanisms to keep the Chinese polity stable. It's not, court politics was not very stable. It was, a lot of things going on in the court. But then, in the long term, when we look at ruler duration, it was very, very long. And also it's actually longer than European kings and queens. The Chinese emperors could stay in power, 20 something years, for a long time. That always taught me something about how rulers should rule when they don't have institutions, right? We still don't have very strong institutions in contemporary China. So therefore, when people say Xi Jinping is trying to eliminate factions, I'm always very puzzled, because it seems to me that it's not very rational for a ruler to eliminate factions, because once you eliminate factions, elites will turn to the ruler for troubles, right? They will not turn to each other when they have troubles. And then I think that's a very, very bad scenario for the ruler in China. So I think if there's one thing that I learned from Chinese emperors, that is, you actually want factions. You want the elites to fight with each other, not with you, but with themselves.
And any final thoughts on state capacity under the party state right now? This is an issue of great speculation, and I think we don't quite know what the fruits of Xi Jinping's focus on governance are. I'm not sure we quite have enough data points to precisely understand how many of the evolutions of governance that have occurred since 2012, how those are going to materially impact the state's ability to mobilize. It strikes me that looking at COVID-19 is a really great case study, because it seems in the early phase, we saw some of the deficiencies of the party state that were then overcome by the great, extraordinary mobilizational capacity that the party state has, especially when the top leader is focused. It strikes me that under Xi, we have, I don't know if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, but we have this sort of Eye of Sauron problem, that when Sauron is looking at something, the state moves, right? It really moves. When the leader shifts their focus to something else, that thing that they were just looking at, all the cadres begin ignoring it. They begin putting their attention elsewhere. And so that just leads to this really intense mobilization on a given issue or topic, followed by extreme laxity as Xi Jinping turns his focus elsewhere. But I wanted to get your kind of concluding thoughts on state capacity under the Xi administration, current or looking forward. Are there any concerns or tensions that you see emerging in the system because of some of the reforms that he has made to the structure and substance of governance?
I'm really glad you brought up COVID-19. I think it's a great contemporary example, because what we are seeing in China now, we see a great success, right? A great success of the state's control of COVID-19 in terms of state monitoring, containing the virus. And also, what really strikes me or impressed me is the degree to which the state is mobilizing society to help the state implement some of the COVID-19 related policies, for example, monitoring the neighborhood, mobilizing people to get the vaccines, things like that. And then, I see a lot of parallel in Chinese history. Certainly there's a revolutionary legacy that, the campaign style policy implementation that the Chinese Communist Party started during the revolutionary era. Certainly we see some of that, but also I see a lot of parallel from imperial China as well. That is, in late imperial periods, one of the main reasons for the Chinese dynasties to last for a long time, for example, the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty, they each lasted for almost 300 years, longer than the United States has existed. And then, one of the key mechanisms for those dynasties to last for a long time is this collaboration between the state and society. So at that time was the local families, because there were a lot of, local lineage groups. They were helping the state implement the policy. For example, they were taking care of local public goods, the dikes, the bridges, the roads. They were funded, taken care of by the local families. They were, sanctioned by the state. The state supported those projects, but then they were paid by the local families. So we see a lot of collaboration between society and the state in late imperial China. And then, we are still seeing some of that today. The families are gone, right? So we no longer have those big lineage groups in China because of the violence during the war era. But then, we still see a lot of local communities, the neighborhood communities, the local societies, community groups, and then they are playing a very important role in collaborating with the state in terms of monitoring the population, helping people get vaccinated. So I think, if there's one lesson that I learned from imperial China that can really teach about governance in contemporary China, I think is the importance of state-society collaboration, or the mobilization of the society. I think it's very important in sustaining this type of rule.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。